The first round took her 3 centimeters above the heart. She kept walking. That was the part the Veil could not understand later, when they ran the footage back and back and back through their prediction lattices, and found that every model, in every branch, in every possible weighting of the wind and the angle and the carbon in her armor plate, said she should have fallen at that step. They could account for ricochets. They could account for adrenaline. They could account for the small, irrational corrections of a primate brain under fire. They could not account for a woman who had decided, on a morning 4 years earlier in a kitchen on Earth, that she was not going to die before she said a particular sentence to a particular alien, and who had been carrying that decision in her like a stone in a pocket ever since. But that comes later. First there is the dropship. The dropship was called Mercy, which was an old human joke about old human ships, and it smelled the way all of them smelled, of sweat and gun oil, and the cheap mint of the gum the medics chewed to keep from throwing up during re-entry. Sergeant Mara Voss sat with her back against the bulkhead and her helmet in her lap, and watched her squad the way she always watched them in the last quiet minute before a drop, which was the way a mother watches sleeping children when she knows she cannot keep them safe, and has not yet forgiven herself for it. There were 9 of them. There had been 12 3 months ago. There had been 37 2 years ago. The math of the war was the math of subtraction, and Mara had long since stopped trying to find a function that bent the other way. Corporal Aitchison was praying, which was new. He had not prayed before Kepri. Private San was tightening and retightening the same strap on his pack, which was old. He had done that since basic. Specialist Reyes was eating, because Reyes always ate before a drop, and Reyes was the only one of them who would still be hungry afterward, which the rest of them resented in the helpless, affectionate way you resent a sibling who has never been afraid of the dark. Lieutenant Akafer came down the line and stopped in front of Mara and crouched, putting one gloved hand on her knee the way he did when he wanted to say something to her that was not for the others. "They know we're coming," he said. "They always know we're coming. This time they know specifically. Intercept says their commander pulled 3 battalions off the southern ridge in the last 6 hours. He's waiting for us in the bunker complex." Mara nodded slowly. She had been a soldier for 19 years, and she had learned to receive bad news the way a stone receives rain. "Then we go in the front door." Akafer smiled. He had a tooth missing on the left side, knocked out by a veil pulse round at Tashin that had stopped half a centimeter from his brain stem, and the gap made his smiles look like a boy's. "That's why I came to you. The new kids are going to need someone to walk in front of them." "I'll walk in front of them." "I know you will," he said, and squeezed her knee and moved on down the line. Mara took the photograph out of the pocket over her chest plate and looked at it for the 30,000th time. It was a printed photograph, real paper, because she did not trust screens to keep the dead. In it, a girl of 7 stood in a kitchen in the colonial habitat on Mars, holding up a drawing of a horse. The horse had 8 legs because the girl had been 7 and had been generous with her horses. Behind the girl, blurred, was a woman who was Mara, laughing. The girl's name had been Iris. The Veil had not known her name when they hit the Martian Habs. They had not known anyone's name. They had run their lattices and decided that the colony was a node in a probability tree they wished to prune, and they had pruned it. Mara remembered the morning very clearly, and she did not try not to. Trying not to had been a phase. It had lasted 6 months, and it had not worked, and after the 6 months she had decided to remember instead, on the theory that a thing carried was lighter than a thing fought. She had been at a forward base on Phobos. The transit lag from Mars' surface was 40 seconds, which was the kind of lag that meant you could hear a person scream and not get there in time to do anything about the scream. The first she had known of the attack was a string of warning pings that came up the chain like bubbles in still water. Then the live feeds from the Vastida's habitat had cut to static, all at once, in a way that live feeds did not cut to static when the cause was technical. Then her commander had come into the briefing room with his cap in his hand, which was the thing officers did, and had not stopped doing in 900 years of armies, when a child of one of their soldiers had been killed. She had not screamed. She had thought later that she should have screamed, that something was wrong with a person who did not scream when she heard that her daughter was dead. But she had not screamed. She had sat in the chair and she had nodded once, and she had asked the commander, very politely, whether he could leave her alone for a few minutes. He had left. She had sat in the chair for 1 hour and 12 minutes, by the clock on the wall, and she had not screamed and she had not wept, and she had not done anything except put her 2 hands flat on the table in front of her and look at them. And at the end of the hour and 12 minutes she had stood up, and she had walked out of the room, and she had reported for the next briefing, and she had been a different person. Iris's husband, Mara's son-in-law, a man named Petter who had loved the girl since they were both 19, had screamed. He had screamed for 3 days. Then he had killed himself, in the way that humans sometimes killed themselves when the math of their grief did not balance, and Mara had been at the funeral, and she had not screamed there either, but she had begun, that day, to carry the sentence in her pocket. She had begun to carry it the way some people carried a wedding ring on a chain after the wife was gone, as a thing that did not have a use anymore, but that you did not put down because the not putting down was the use. The sentence was, "My daughter's name was Iris." She had practiced saying it. She had practiced it in front of the mirror in officers' quarters. She had practiced it in the shower. She had practiced it once into the open mouth of a Vale corpse on a battlefield outside Kepri, leaning down close enough to smell the strange, dry cinnamon smell of Vale blood, and saying the sentence flat into the dead face, and walking away and feeling absolutely nothing, because dead Vale did not count. None of them counted until one of them, alive and listening and able to carry the sentence back to the others, heard it. That was the thing she was walking toward. That was the thing she had been walking toward for 4 years. Mara put the photograph back in the pocket. She did this very carefully, the way you put a sleeping child down. 2 minutes, the pilot said. The Mercy banked, and through the slit of the forward viewport Mara saw the moon they were about to land on. It was called Hadrian's Reach on the human maps, and something untranslatable on the Vale ones, something that meant, roughly, the place where the certainty thins. The Vale had named it that because it was a moon at the edge of a gravity well that did interesting things to their prediction engines. Probabilities frayed here. Futures got harder to read. It was the kind of place where a precog civilization went to be reassured, periodically, that the universe was still mostly knowable. They had built their forward command bunker on it for the same reason. A man whistles in a dark room. Mara understood then, with the small, clean clarity she got sometimes in the last seconds before a drop, that this was why command had sent her here. Not because of the bunker, because of the thinning. Humans were already an anomaly to the Vale. Every species the Vale had ever conquered had run on probabilities the lattices could chew. Predator species optimized for predation. Prey species optimized for survival. Trader species optimized for gain. Humans optimized for. The Vale analysts had argued about this in their long musical sentences for 60 years now. Humans optimized for nothing. Humans optimized against themselves. Humans walked into fires to pull out strangers' children. Humans stayed in burning buildings to find the cat. Humans got shot above the heart and kept walking because of a sentence they had not yet said. On a normal moon, the Vale lattices could still get a grip on a human, more or less, by the law of large numbers. Most humans, most of the time, did the predictable thing. The outliers averaged out. On Hadrian's Reach, the outliers did not average out. On Hadrian's Reach, the outliers became weather. 1 minute. Mara put her helmet on and the world went tactical. Numbers crawled across her vision. Her squad lit up in soft green dots. Akefer was a brighter dot at the front of the line. Beyond him, through the hull, the dropship's sensors painted the bunker complex in red threat geometry, 6 interlocking domes of Vale ferrocrete, the kind that ate a kinetic round and politely returned the calories as heat. Anti-air emplacements bristled along the ridgelines. The numbers said the survival probability of a frontal assault by a single squad was 0.003. The numbers had said 0.003 at Kepri, too. And at Tashin, and at the broken orbital over Min, Mara had walked out of all of them, not because she was lucky, because the numbers did not include the sentence in her pocket. 30 seconds, brace. She looked down the line one more time. Aitchison had stopped praying and was watching her. She found, slightly to her surprise, that she had something to say to him. "Hey," she said on the squad channel, "when we get down there, stay behind me. Sarge, all of you, stay behind me. Whatever you see happening to me, you stay behind me and you keep firing past my shoulders, and you do not stop until we are inside that bunker. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Sarge," came the chorus, ragged. Ray, still chewing, said, "What about you?" Myra was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to walk," she said. The dropship hit the deck. The ramp dropped and the world became noise. The Veil did not announce themselves. They did not need to. They had read the lattices and positioned their fire to converge on the ramp's footprint at the exact second of touchdown, and they had been right about the second. And so the air around the Mercy filled instantly with the white-blue threads of pulse fire braided through the slower red of kinetic tracers, and 3 of the squad were dead before their boots touched dirt. Aitchison was not one of them. San was not one of them. Reyes was not one of them. The 3 who fell were called Park, Mwangi, and Velasquez, and Mara registered their squad dots winking out the way you register a clock ticking in a room where someone is dying, peripherally, with a small, terrible patience, because there is nothing else to do with the information yet. She was already walking. That was the thing about a Veil ambush. The Veil set them up with the assumption that the targeted humans would do what targeted humans did, which was to dive for cover, regroup, and advance by fire and maneuver. The lattices had been very clear on this point. Humans were stubborn, but they were not stupid. Humans took cover. Myra did not take cover. She walked out of the dropship in a straight line toward the nearest pulse emplacement, 400 meters across open black sand, and she fired her rifle from the hip in short controlled bursts, and she did not run, and she did not weave, and she did not duck. She walked. The way you walk through a kitchen toward a kettle. The way you walk toward a thing you have been walking toward for 4 years. The first round took her 3 centimeters above the heart. It was a glancing hit. The armor caught most of it, but most of a Veil pulse round was still enough to crack 2 ribs and bruise the lung beneath them and put a starburst of black across her vision. She felt herself stagger. She felt the stagger pass through her like a wave through a rope and dissipate into the sand. She kept walking. Behind her, she heard Akafor screaming orders, getting the squad off the ramp, getting them into the lee of a fallen rock that the Veil lattices had probably already designated as the most likely human cover and were even now bracketing with mortar fire. The mortars would come in 3 seconds. They came in 3 seconds. The rock split. Aitchison rolled out coughing. "On me," Mara shouted, not turning. "Behind me now." They came. God help them, they came. The second round took her in the meat of the left thigh. She went down on one knee. The body did that without asking her, and she put her hand in the sand and pushed herself back up and kept walking. And behind her she heard Reyes say, in the small flat voice Reyes used when she was about to do something brave, "Holy shit." "Eyes forward, specialist," Mara said. The pulse emplacement was 100 meters away. She could see the Veil gunner now, a tall, narrow shape inside the gun pit, the long, elegant neck and the 4-jointed arms and the dorsal crest that on a Veil in good health flushed pale violet in moments of stress. This one's crest was the color of a bruise. He was firing as fast as the weapon would cycle. He kept missing. He had not missed at the start. He was missing now. Mara understood why. The lattices were screaming at him. The lattices were telling him that the human in front of him was a 0.003 event, an outlier, a smear of noise in a clean signal, and that any second now the universe would correct itself and she would fall. The lattices were telling him not to adjust his aim. The lattices were telling him that the next round, statistically, had to hit. The next round hit. It hit her in the left shoulder and spun her halfway around. She finished the turn on her own and kept walking. 70 meters. 50. The Veil gunner stopped firing. Mara could see his face now through the slit of the pit. The Veil had faces that humans could mostly read. After the first year of the war, they had developed the reading the way you develop a callus, out of necessity. This one's face was doing something she had only seen once before, on a captured Veil pilot at Tashin who had watched her squad take his ship apart around him. It was the face of a creature whose universe had stopped working. She shot him through the slit at 30 meters. He fell backward off the firing platform and out of sight. Mara climbed into the pit. She sat down for a second, just a second, on the gunner's still warm bench, and she put her hand against her ribs and felt the wetness there and decided not to look at it yet. Her squad was coming up behind her. Aitchison first, then San, then Reyes carrying the heavy weapon, then Akafor at the back herding them. They piled into the pit. Aitchison started cutting open her armor at the shoulder to get at the wound. Sarge, you have got to. Patch it, don't pull anything out. We're not stopping. Sarge, you've been hit 3 times. Patch it, she said, and then she said quietly enough that only he heard, I have to walk. Aitchison was 23 years old and he had a girlfriend on Ceres, and he wanted to be a teacher when the war ended, and the war was not going to end. He looked at his sergeant for a long moment, and then he nodded, and he patched her. While he worked, she took out the flask. It was a small steel flask with a dent in one side. The dent was from Tashin, where a piece of shrapnel had hit it and stopped, and Mara had decided afterward not to fix the dent, because the dent was the reason she still had a liver. She unscrewed the cap and took 1 sip and passed the flask to San, who took 1 sip and passed it to Reyes, who took 1 sip and passed it to Akafor, who took 2 sips because Akafor was the lieutenant and lieutenants were allowed, and Akafor passed it back to Mara, and Mara screwed the cap back on and put the flask in her pocket next to the photograph. This was the ritual. It had always been the ritual. There had been 12 of them 3 months ago, and the flask had gone 12 times around. Now it went 5. All right, Mara said. She climbed out of the pit and started walking again. The second emplacement was 800 meters east, around the shoulder of the ridge. Between her and it was a stretch of open ground and a Veil skirmish line of about 20 soldiers, dug into shallow positions, with 2 mounted weapons and what the icons in her HUD said was a probability disruptor. A thing the Veil used to thicken the local lattice, to make their own predictions sharper and the enemy's actions clearer. It was a heavy gray box on a tripod with a slowly rotating dish on top, and it was humming, and Mara, who had never been afraid of a Veil weapon in her life, was a little afraid of it now. Not because of what it would do to her, because of what it might do to the squad behind her. Reyes, she said. Sarge. The disruptor, center of the line, take it out first. On it. Reyes set up the heavy weapon on the lip of the pit and fired 1 round. The round went exactly where Reyes meant it to go, because Reyes was the best shot in the company and had been since basic. The disruptor came apart in a soft blue flash that for 1 second made the air taste like copper. The Veil skirmish line opened fire. Mara walked into it. This is the part the footage shows. This is the part the Veil played back later in the bunker, on every screen they had, while their commander stood in front of the central display with his crest going through every color it had ever been and a few it had not. A human woman in cracked armor, walking across 400 meters of open ground toward 20 entrenched soldiers, while pulse fire braided around her and through her. The lattices had given her, at the start of the walk, a survival probability of 0.0008. They updated continuously. They updated every 20th of a second. They went down. They went down. They went to 0.0001, which was the floor. The lattice did not report numbers smaller than that, because numbers smaller than that were not, strictly speaking, possible in a universe with conservation of momentum. She was hit 4 more times during the walk, once in the side, where the round skidded along a rib and exited without finding anything important, once in the right calf, which made her limp, once in the helmet, which cracked the visor and filled her left eye with blood, once in the lower back, which should have severed her spine but did not, because the veil round had passed first through the body of Private San, who had been walking 3 paces behind her and a little to the left, and who absorbed enough of the round's energy with his death to leave Mara, when it reached her, only crippled and not killed. She did not turn around. She did not stop. She heard San fall and she said his name once under her breath, and she kept walking. Halfway across the open ground, she began to hum. It was a low, tuneless hum at first, the kind of sound a person makes when they are concentrating on a task and have forgotten to be silent. Then it found a melody. The melody was an old one, a lullaby in a language Mara's mother had spoken to her, and that Mara had spoken to Iris, and that Iris, on the last morning, holding the drawing of the 8-legged horse, had hummed back to her in the kitchen while Mara made coffee. The veil, monitoring her vital channels through her cracked armor's leaking telemetry, recorded the hum. They did not know what it was. They fed it to the lattice. The lattice did not know what it was. The lattice had categories for human battle cries, human prayers, human curses, human pleas. It did not have a category for a woman humming her dead daughter's lullaby while walking into rifle fire. The lattice flagged the hum as anomalous data and asked permission to discard it. In the bunker, on the central display, Commander Ishkoral of the 7th Veil Expedition watched the woman walk and watched the lattice fail to discard the hum and watched his own crest, reflected faintly in the dark glass of the display, go a color he had no name for. He was 340 years old. He had fought in 71 campaigns. He had been promoted twice for victories the lattice had predicted at 98%, and once for a victory the lattice had predicted at 63%, which was considered, in Veil military culture, daring. He had never in his life seen the lattice update past 0.0001. The lattice was now reporting, against its own programming, against the conservation of momentum, a survival probability for the walking human of 0.00006. It is important here to understand what the lattice was. The Veil had not always had it. They had been once a species of pack predators on a hot, wet world, hunting in 4s and 5s along the edges of slow river deltas, and in those days they had been afraid of a great many things, the way every species is afraid of a great many things before it builds the apparatus that lets it stop being afraid. They had been afraid of the rivers in flood. They had been afraid of the great cats that hunted in the reeds. They had been afraid of the dark and of their own dreams and of each other. They had been afraid, especially, of the future, because the future was a thing that came at you out of a place you could not see and did things to you that you could not predict. The lattice was the apparatus they had built to stop being afraid of the future. It had taken them 400,000 years. It had begun as a set of small folk rituals, the reading of bones, the watching of birds, the careful tallying of who had married whom and what their children had been like. It had become, eventually, a science. The science had become a discipline. The discipline had become a religion. The religion had become an industry. The industry had become, in the Veil mature civilization, the central organizing principle of the species. Every action taken, every law passed, every war fought, run first through the great recursive engines that simulated forward into the probability tree and reported back what was likely to happen. The Veil did not act on intuition. The Veil did not act on faith. The veil acted on the lattice, and the lattice was almost always right, and the times when it was not almost always right were treated as engineering problems to be solved by building a better lattice. The lattice had never failed catastrophically. There had been small failures, local anomalies, decoherences in the prediction field around certain dense gravity wells, the occasional rogue subroutine that had to be patched. These had been studied and repaired. The lattice as a whole had been, for 40,000 years, the most reliable instrument in the known galaxy. And now, in front of Ish-Coral, on a display in a bunker on a moon at the edge of a gravity well that did interesting things to certainty, the lattice was failing. Not in a small local way. In the deep way. In the way that a religion fails when a priest, mid-prayer, looks at the altar and notices that there is no one on the other side of it. The woman was still walking. "That number cannot exist," said his adjutant, in the soft cluster trill of veil alarm. "I am aware. Sir, the disruptor is gone. We have lost the local lattice resolution. We are working from orbital data only. I am aware of that as well. Sir, how many shots did the skirmish line take?" 43, sir. How many hits?" 8. And she is still walking?" "Yes, sir." Ish-Coral was silent. The hum continued, threaded through the gunfire on the audio channel, very small and very steady, the way water is small and steady in a way that eventually wears the stone. In one of the deeper galleries of veil thought, in a place Ish-Coral had not visited in 300 years, an old memory turned over. His own mother, on the day she had been taken by the council to be unmade for a heresy, had hummed something. He could not remember what. He had been very young. He had remembered for a long time afterward the humming more than the unmaking. The heresy, he remembered now, had been a small one. His mother had argued, in a paper read before a regional academy, that the lattice produced not predictions but performances, that the act of consulting the lattice was itself a way of constraining the future into the shape the lattice expected, and that a species which lived inside its own prediction engine had stopped, in any meaningful sense, choosing. The paper had been considered by the council to be the kind of thing that if widely read would damage public confidence in the apparatus. His mother had been taken. She had been unmade. She had hummed. He had not in 3 centuries allowed himself to wonder whether she had been right. He allowed himself now 2 seconds of wondering. Then he shook his crest. The memory subsided. But it did not subside entirely. It settled instead a little lower into the part of him that listened to the audio channel and could not stop hearing the human woman's small, steady hum. "Reinforce the skirmish line," he said. "Pull a platoon from the southern arc." "Sir, the southern arc." "Do it." Out on the black sand, the platoon arrived. Mara was 30 meters from the skirmish line when they came up over the rise. 40 fresh veil soldiers in good cover, with clean weapons and intact crests. Behind her, of her original 12, there were 4 left walking: Aitchison, Reyes, Akaffer, and a private named Holloway who had joined them 2 months ago, and who was very young and very quiet, and had not yet been issued the privilege of using the flask. The 4 of them were firing past Mara's shoulders as instructed. They were doing it well. Reyes was killing a veil every 6 seconds, with the cold artisan precision of a person who has decided that what she is doing is no longer war, it is a craft. Aitchison was reloading and firing and reloading and firing and weeping, openly, the tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his face. Akeffer was talking to all of them at once, the way a good lieutenant talks, a low constant murmur of good, good on the left, watch the left, good. Mara walked into the line. She did not, by then, look like a woman. She looked like a thing the war had made out of a woman. Armor cracked open along 3 different lines, blood from the shoulder and the thigh and the ribs and the back and the eye. Helmet half off because she had unbuckled it after the visor cracked and could not be bothered to pull it free. hair matted black and wet, mouth still humming. She walked into the Vale skirmish line, and she killed them. She did it with the rifle until the rifle ran dry. She did it with the sidearm until the sidearm ran dry. She did it with a knife. She did it at one point with her hands because a veil reached for her, and she was closer than the knife. The veil had a long, elegant neck. It was not built to take the kind of pressure a human's hands could put on it. When she was finished, the skirmish line was finished too, and so was the platoon Ishkoral had pulled from the southern arc, and so was Holloway, who had taken a round through the throat at the last second of the engagement, and who fell forward into Acheson's arms with a look of mild surprise on his face, as if he had expected the war to be different. There were now 3 of them plus Mara. The bunker was 400 meters up the slope. But between them and the bunker was a thing the lattice had built that the lattice had never had to use. The Vale called it the Last Gate. It was a kind of trench, sunk into the black sand and lined with smart ferrocrete that hardened under fire, and it ran in a half-moon arc around the bunker's outer doors at a distance of 200 meters. Inside the trench were the bunker's personal guard, 20 Vale in heavy armor, the kind of armor the lattice had calculated over millennia to be the precise minimum required to defeat any infantry-scale weapon a known enemy was likely to deploy. They were not soldiers. They were not even, in the Vale military sense, a unit. They were a courtesy that the lattice paid to the small statistical possibility that someone would ever get this close. Nobody had ever gotten this close. The personal guard had stood at their posts for 40,000 years, in shifts, and the only thing any of them had ever shot at was a training drone. Mara crossed the open ground between the skirmish line and the trench in the same way she had crossed everything else, which was on foot, with the rifle she had taken from a dead Vale, because her own had run dry, and with her 3 soldiers behind her in the loose triangle, and with the hum. When she was 100 meters out, the personal guard opened fire. It was, by an order of magnitude, the heaviest fire any of them had taken yet. The Vale heavy weapons were not the pulse rifles of the skirmish line. They were sustained beam weapons, designed for armored vehicles, and the air between Mara and the trench filled with the white-hot lines of them, crisscrossing into a kind of lattice of their own, a small bright cage of light through which she was being asked to walk. She walked. She was hit twice more in the first 30 seconds, once across the back of the right hand, which burned away 2 of her fingers cleanly enough that she did not, in the moment, register the loss. Once along the left cheekbone, which opened the skin from her eye socket to her jaw and let her see, briefly, the inside of her own face in the small mirror of the rifle's scope before the scope shattered. She did not stop. She did not stop humming either. The hum was, by now, less a melody than a function, a thing she did to keep the count of her breath even, a thing she did because if she stopped doing it she was afraid she would notice how tired she was. At 60 meters, she went down on one knee. The right leg, the one she had been favoring since the second shot of the day, had finally given up the femoral muscle, perforated 3 times and held together by stubbornness and clotting agent, had let go in a way that made a sound. She knelt in the sand and she put her one good hand flat on the ground and she breathed 3 breaths, in and out, the way she had been taught to breathe in basic when the body was about to fail. Acheson was beside her. He was beside her without having decided to be. He had simply seen her go down and walked up and crouched, and now he was pulling a stim from his belt and looking at her face for permission. "Sarge, do it." He did it. He drove the stim into the meat of her thigh above the wound, and the stim, which was a thing the human pharmaceutical industry had spent 8 years designing to do exactly this, did exactly this. The leg came back. It came back wrong. There was no signal from the parts of it that had been shot, but the muscle fired, and the knee straightened, and Mara stood up. "All right," she said. "Sarge, your fingers. I have other ones. Sarge. Acheson, look at me." He looked at her. Her face was open along the cheekbone, Her armor was a ruin. She had 2 fingers on her right hand. She was holding a rifle she could not properly fire one-handed. "I am going to get to that bunker," she said. "I am going to walk into it. I am going to look at whatever Vale is in command of it, and I am going to say my daughter's name to him. And then I am going to come back out and you are going to take me home. Is that clear?" "Yes, Sarge." "Now help me up the rest of the way." He helped her. Reyes came up on her other side, and the 2 of them put their shoulders under her arms, and HFY walked ahead with the heavy weapon drawing fire. The 4 of them advanced toward the trench like a single broken animal, lurching, on 5 working legs between them, and the hum did not stop. At 40 meters, HFY took a beam across the chest plate that buckled the armor but did not kill him. He grunted and kept walking. At 20 meters, Reyes shot the gunner who had hit HFY. At 10 meters, the personal guard, who had never in their 40,000 years of service seen anything come this close to the bunker doors, did a thing the lattice had not predicted and could not have predicted, because there had been no precedent in the tree. They broke. It happened all at once, the way panic happens in a unit that has not been trained for panic. The Vale on the left end of the trench dropped his weapon and ran. The Vale beside him saw the first one run and ran too. The contagion moved down the line in both directions like a fuse burning. By the time Mara and her 3 soldiers reached the lip of the trench, it was empty. There were dropped weapons in the sand. There was here and there a piece of dropped equipment, a helmet, a pack, a small Vale personal item that one of them had carried for luck and had let fall in the running. Mara looked down into the empty trench. She was breathing hard. She was bleeding from places she had stopped cataloging. "Huh," she said. "Sarge." 40,000 years, she said, to no one in particular, and we made them run. She took the flask out of her pocket. She unscrewed it with the 2 fingers she had left, which was harder than it looked. She took 1 sip. She passed it to Reyes. Reyes took 1 sip. Reyes passed it to Aitchison. Aitchison passed it to HFY. HFY took 2 sips, because he was still the lieutenant, and the rules were the rules, even on the lip of an empty Vale trench in the amber light of a moon at the edge of a thinning gravity well. The flask came back to Mara. She put it in her pocket. The bunker was 400 meters become 200 meters become, as she started walking again, 190 meters. The bunker was 400 meters up the slope. She started walking. In the bunker, Ishkoral was very still. His crest had stopped cycling. It had settled on a single color, a deep and saturated indigo that in Vale physiology indicated a state his species reached perhaps 3 times in a long life, a state for which the closest human translation was the moment in which a creature understands that it has been wrong about the shape of the universe and is going to have to live, briefly, inside the new shape before deciding what to do. "Commander," his adjutant said. "I see her. The lattice is producing errors, sir. It is no longer producing probabilities. It is producing, sir, it is producing what the engineers are calling category violations. It is suggesting outcomes that do not exist in the tree. Such as the woman reaching this bunker, sir. And killing me. And yes, sir. And what else?" The adjutant was silent for a moment. Vale adjutants did not lie to their commanders, but they sometimes paused. "And not killing you, sir," the adjutant said. Ishkoral turned slowly and looked at the adjutant. "Explain." "The lattice produced both outcomes, sir, simultaneously, as superposed possibilities of approximately equal weight. It cannot resolve which she will do. It has, sir, the engineers say it has never produced a moral branch before. It has only ever produced kinetic ones. It is producing a moral branch." "A moral branch?" "Yes, sir." Ishkoral looked at the central display. On the display, the woman was walking up the slope toward his bunker, limping on the right leg, blood pooling in the visor of her cracked helmet, humming. There were 3 soldiers in a loose triangle behind her, firing past her shoulders at the last few defensive positions on the slope. What does the lattice recommend? It does not recommend, sir. It is no longer recommending. What do you recommend? The adjutant was silent for a longer time. I recommend, sir, that we consider whether we have understood this species. Ishkoral was quiet. He thought about his mother, who he had not thought about in 3 centuries. He thought about the small, steady humming, which on the audio channel was now louder than the gunfire because there was less gunfire. He thought about the 71 campaigns, every one of them resolved by the lattice in advance, every one of them a kind of theater performed for the benefit of beings who already knew how the play would end. He thought about Hadrian's Reach, the place where the certainty thins. He understood, suddenly and entirely, why his species had built a bunker here. It was not to study the thinning. It was to be reassured that the thinning was small and could be contained. It was a shrine built against doubt. The woman walking up the slope was the thinning. The woman walking up the slope was doubt with a face. Open the outer doors, he said. The adjutant went very still. Sir. You heard me. The outer doors are the last line, sir. If we open them. Open them. The adjutant opened them. Outside, Mara was 20 meters from the bunker when the great ferrocrete plates of the outer doors began to slide apart. She stopped walking for the first time in an hour. Aitchison stopped behind her. Reyes stopped. Akafor stopped. Sarge, Akafor said very quietly, what is happening? I don't know. The doors finished opening. Inside, the bunker was lit a soft amber. Ishkoral stood in the center of the open doorway, alone, his weapons on the floor at his feet, his 4 arms held away from his body in the universal veil gesture of disarmament, his crest the deep indigo of a creature who has understood something. Mara raised her rifle. Stay back, she said on the squad channel, all of you. Stay back. She walked forward alone into the amber light of the bunker. She walked until she was 3 meters from the Veil commander, and she stopped, and she pointed the rifle at the center of his thorax, where the long jointed sternum protected the cluster of vital organs the Veil called the singing house. At that range, with the rifle she carried, she could have killed him by squeezing once. She did not squeeze. She was breathing hard. Blood was running down her left side and pooling in her boot, and she could feel the boot squelch when she shifted her weight. Her left eye was useless. Her ribs were broken. There were, by the count she had stopped keeping, 7 separate puncture wounds in her body. She looked at Ishkoral. Ishkoral looked at her. He spoke. He spoke in Veil, and her helmet translated, and his voice in the translation came out flat and clean and small. I surrender, he said. I, Ishkoral, commander of the 7th expedition, surrender my command, my bunker, my soldiers, and my person to you. The lattice is broken. I do not know what you will do. I ask only that you allow my soldiers to live. Mara was silent for a long moment. Then she said the sentence she had been carrying in her pocket for 4 years. My daughter's name was Iris. Ishkoral was very still. Her name was Iris, Mara said. She was 7 years old. She liked horses. She drew them with 8 legs because she thought 4 were not enough to carry such large animals. She lived in the 3rd habitat on the Vastitas plain on Mars. Your people did not know her name. I am telling you her name. Iris. Iris, said Ishkoral in his own voice, and the translation did not bother to translate, because the word came through unchanged. I have walked 4 years to tell you her name. Iris, he said again. Mara lowered the rifle. She did not lower it all the way. She lowered it to her hip, where it hung loose and ready, the way a rifle hangs on a soldier who has decided not to fire but has not yet decided not to be a soldier. You have children, she said. It was not a question. She had read his file briefly in the dropship. The Veil had children. They called them something else, but they had them, and the commander had 3. I have 3. Their names. He told her the names. They were long Veil names, full of cluster trills and breath pauses, and her helmet stumbled through them. She listened anyway, the way she had wanted for 4 years, for someone on his side to listen to her. When he was finished, she nodded. I am not going to kill you, she said. The adjutant behind him in the bunker made a small sound. Ishkoral did not turn. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. I am not doing it for you. I am doing it because if I kill you, your lattice will mark me as the predictable outcome. It will write me into its tree. It will say, ah, the human did what the human was always going to do. And every Veil who reads my file from this day forward will close it and say, yes, we understand humans now. And the next human who walks up a slope humming her daughter's lullaby will be a known quantity. And I will not let her be a known quantity. Do you understand me? Ishkoral was silent for a moment. He understood. He understood entirely. Yes, he said. Then live. Live and tell them what you saw. Tell them you saw a human walk through your gunfire with 7 wounds in her body humming a lullaby, and that when she got to your door she did not kill you because she chose not to, and that you cannot predict what she will choose next time either, and that the lattice was a lie your people told yourselves so you would not have to feel afraid in the dark. Tell them that. Tell every Veil that. Will you do it? I will do it. Good. Mara turned. Her boots squelched again. She walked back across the threshold of the bunker into the amber-shaded daylight of Hadrian's Reach, and her 3 remaining soldiers came forward to catch her, because she was, by then, falling. Reyes caught her under the arms. Aitchison caught her legs. HFY was already shouting for the medevac, which had been holding in orbit because the lattice had told the Veil an hour ago that there would be no human survivors, and the Veil had broadcast that to anyone listening, including the medevac pilots, who had not believed it because they were human, and because they had been waiting on Mara Voss's call for an hour, and Mara Voss did not miss calls. The medevac came down. While they waited, sitting on the black sand in the strange amber light of the surrendered bunker, Mara opened the pocket over her chest and took out the photograph and the dent-sided flask, and she handed the flask to Aitchison and said, "Pass it." He passed it. It went to Reyes, who took a long pull, and to HFY, who took 2, and back to Aitchison, who took 1. There were 4 of them now. There had been 12 3 months ago, and 37 2 years ago, and the subtraction was not a function that bent the other way. But the flask was still moving, and the sentence was said, and the photograph was in her hand, and the lattice in the bunker behind them had stopped trying to predict her. The medics loaded her onto the stretcher. She was conscious for the lift. She watched the bunker recede beneath her, and she watched Ishkoral standing in the open doorway with his crest gone soft and pale, and she watched her 3 soldiers walking alongside the stretcher with their rifles low, and she watched, in her mind, a kitchen in a Martian habitat where a girl of 7 held up a drawing of a horse with 8 legs. The dropship pilot, when they reached the Mercy, was a woman Mara had known since basic. The pilot looked at Mara's wounds and said, in the same flat voice the pilot used to announce re-entry, "Jesus Voss." Mara smiled. It was a small smile and her teeth were red. "Tell them," she said. "Tell who what?" "Tell command. Tell them the lattice is broken." "The Veil lattice." "All of them," Mara said. "Every lattice, every prediction. Every clean number anyone ever gave anybody about what a person was going to do. Tell them it is broken. Tell them we broke it." "Voss." "And tell them," Mara said, and her voice was getting smaller and the medics were starting the drip, "tell them that I want a posting on Hadrian's Reach, permanent, when I am healed. I want to be stationed in the place where the certainty thins. I want to be there. I want to be a piece of weather there. Do you understand me?" "I understand you." "Good," Mara said and closed her eyes. She did not die. She did not die for a long time, in fact. She lived another 41 years, and was stationed on Hadrian's Reach for 33 of them, and was, in her later decades, a kind of legend that the Vale told their children when they wanted to teach them about the limits of the lattice. The Vale children called her the woman who walked. They drew her, sometimes in the long, beautiful Vale style, with too many wounds and a small open mouth, humming. The recovery was not quick. The recovery was, in fact, the longest and most difficult thing Mara had ever done, longer and more difficult than the walk itself, because the walk had been short and had been done in the high white light of certainty about what she was walking toward, and the recovery was performed in the low gray light of hospitals, with no clear destination, with the body refusing each morning to be the thing she had previously thought of as her body. She lost the 2 fingers permanently. She gained a prosthetic eye, which never quite tracked correctly, and which the medics offered to replace twice, and which she declined to replace because the slight wrongness of it reminded her, every time she caught her face in a mirror, of what she had been willing to spend. She did the rehabilitation in a wing of a military hospital on Ceres, in a long sunlit room that overlooked a botanical garden the engineers had built into the side of the dome. She walked, in those months, around and around the garden slowly, with a cane at first, and then without. She walked the way a person walks who is teaching her body what walking means again. The other patients in the wing, soldiers mostly from a dozen fronts, got into the habit of falling in behind her in the mornings when she did her loop. They did not speak. They walked. They followed the woman who had not yet fallen in a small ragged column around a garden on a dwarf planet, and the staff of the hospital wing began, after some weeks, to refer to the morning loop as the procession, and then, after some more weeks, simply as Voss's walk, and then to refer to it not at all, because it had become so customary that it no longer required a name. When she was well enough, she requested the posting on Hadrian's Reach. She got it. She got it because the request had been telegraphed up the chain by the medevac pilot, as instructed, and by the time the request crossed her own commanding officer's desk, it had already been approved by 3 commanders above him, none of whom were going to be the one to tell Mara Voss she could not go where she wanted to go. She arrived on the moon in the 2nd year after the surrender. The bunker had been demilitarized. The Vale had withdrawn it as part of the armistice, the small private armistice that Ishkoral had negotiated, almost single-handedly, in the months after his court-martial, over the objection of 3/4 of the Vale High Council, and with the support of the 1/4 who had read the lattice diagnostics and understood what had happened on the slope. The bunker had been converted, by joint agreement, into a research station. Vale scientists worked on one side of the central corridor. Human scientists worked on the other. In the middle, in the room where Ishkoral had once stood at the central display and watched a woman walk through gunfire, there was now a small museum. The museum had 3 exhibits. One was a piece of cracked human armor mounted on a stand. One was a Vale prediction disruptor broken with the dish gone. One was a dent-sided flask. They were not labeled. The Vale who came through and the humans who came through looked at them and either knew what they were or did not know what they were, and the ones who did not know did not ask, because there was something in the air of the room that suggested asking was not the point. Mara did not visit the museum often. She did not need to. She had her own small office down the corridor, with the photograph on the wall and the flask on a nail beside it, and she did not need to look at a museum to remember. Ishkoral kept his word, he told them. He told every Vale who would listen, and many who would not, and he was demoted for it, and then court-martialed for it, and then, in the end, listened to, because by then there had been other humans, on other moons, walking other walks, and the lattices were producing more and more category violations, and the Vale Council was beginning to suspect that there had been something wrong with the way they understood the universe for a very long time. He retired to a small house on a coastal cliff on his home world, and he wrote a book, and the book was, in the loose Vale sense of the word, a confession. The opening sentence of the book, translated into Standard, was, "I once watched a human walk through gunfire humming a song, and I understood that I had been afraid of the wrong thing for all of my life." The book sold well. It went through 6 printings in the first Vale year and was translated, eventually, into 11 other species languages, and won the kind of prize the Vale gave for books that changed the way the species understood itself. Ish Coral did not attend the ceremony. He sent, instead, a letter to be read in his place, in which he said that the book had not been his work but the woman's, and that any prize the book had earned should be considered, in the deeper accounting, hers, and that he hoped she was well, on the moon where the certainty thinned, and that he thought of her often on his cliff, when the wind came in off the sea and made small steady sounds against the windows. She did write back. Once, she sent him by Vale diplomatic courier a postcard with a picture of the botanical garden on Ceres on the front, and on the back in her clean small handwriting the single line, "I am well, I still hum sometimes. Vas." He framed the postcard. He hung it in his study over the desk where he had written the book. He looked at it every morning for the rest of his life, which was another 61 Vale years, and his children, after he was gone, kept it on the same wall, and his grandchildren kept it after them, and it is still there in the small house on the cliff, which has become a museum of its own, and which receives every year several thousand visitors, many of them human and many of them Vale, who stand in the small study and look at the postcard for a few minutes and then leave without speaking. On Hadrian's Reach, in the small office Mara kept in the old bunker, she hung the photograph on the wall behind her desk. The drawing of the 8-legged horse, the girl of 7. Behind her, blurred, the woman who was Mara, laughing. Beside the photograph she hung the dent-sided flask, on a nail, because she did not drink any more, and because the flask was for ritual, and the ritual was over, and what was left of the ritual was an object on a nail in a small office on a moon at the edge of a gravity well that did interesting things to certainty. When new soldiers came through, she would take them on the walk. She would walk them across the 400 meters of black sand from the dropship pad to the bunker doors. She would walk slowly because of the limp, which had never quite gone away. She would tell them partway across, "This is where the disruptor was," and later, "This is where sand fell," and later still, "This is where I stopped humming." And they would ask every time every new soldier the same question. They would ask, "Sarge, how did you keep walking?" And Mara would stop, on whatever piece of the sand she happened to be on, and she would look at them with the one good eye and the one milky one, and she would say, "I didn't keep walking, I just hadn't fallen yet." And then she would start walking again. And the new soldiers every time would follow her, because that was what people did on Hadrian's Reach, in the place where the certainty thinned. They followed the woman who had not yet fallen, across the sand, toward the bunker, in a line, the way humans had been doing since before there was a word for human, since before there was a word for anything, moving forward in a small ragged column behind someone who was leaking and humming and would not stop. The lattice could not predict it. It never could. It never will.